Welcome to Afros and Audio's Black History Month interview series. My name is Talib Jasir, founder and CEO of Afros Podcast Festival and the Vanguard Podcast Network. I'm excited to spotlight 29 outstanding indie podcast creatives and professionals who answer the call to be a part of this series. My guest today is Yndia. Welcome and thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. You're renowned as a public scholar, author, and storyteller. Could you share how your work in scholar activism intertwines with your podcasting journey?
Oh, wow. So I would start off to say that I'm a Brooklyn girl forever, changing the hearts and minds of those just one story at a time. So part of my scholarship and being a professor, I've been a university professor for over 22 years. I'm a sociologist by training, and I focus on issues related to race, social inequality, social justice, American immigration. And I like to start off with a story about the impetus for the podcast. So my podcast is called Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness. And the idea of the podcast came from me writing my third monograph, which hopefully will be published in 26. And that book project is called Journeys of Belonging to Blackness. And I've been interviewing over 40 people who I self-identify as African descendants globally. And it's very specific that I say African descendants because the notion of Blackness means something very different depending on where you are in the world. And these are individuals that may have or may have not decided to participate in those biogeographic ancestry technologies. What I mean by that are some of the popular ones we've heard of, 23andMe, Ancestry.com. And part of the work is to really understand how is it that African descendants think about and conceptualize what does it mean to belong to this notion of Blackness, even though we are global. And I would say through the course of my interviews with these individuals who ranged in age from 18 to, at the time, 70 years old, of a range of different ethnicities and nationalities, although they all identify as African descendant. Great conversations were done. I stopped the recording, and it's in those moments of the downtime that I'm actually getting to know some of the individuals that shared their moments and shared their stories with me. And I just thought, wow, these people are interesting and phenomenal and every day. And I wish more people knew about their journeys, their stories, their experiences. So while they're being interviewed for my project and talking about, well, what did it feel like to see that you were 83% Nigerian? But then when we're offline, it's, wow, you are a documentarian and you fly all across South America exploring African descendants on that continent. That's interesting. How many people do we run into that do that sort of work? Or you're a composer and you've traveled around through all of these world-renowned symphonies playing the cello. That's amazing. I don't know any Black cellists, right? So I just thought to myself, we're constantly inundated with so many negative stories and frames about African descendants that wouldn't it be important and timely to be able to flood the public discourse and amplify the more positive global experiences of who we are 365 days of the year. So as an academic, we like long titles. We're not quite imaginative. So if the book project is called Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, I thought, well, why not a podcast that says Talking? And there we go. So that's the way in which I kind of see the podcast as one facet of the work that I do intertwined with my scholar activism.
That's awesome. I love that story. I appreciate you sharing it with myself and the audience. You mentioned straight out the back, you're Brooklyn to the core. So as a proud Brooklyn native, how do your roots influence your work and how do you bridge local experiences with global social issues in your podcast?
Sure. So sadly, I no longer reside in New York, in Brooklyn, although my heartstrings and everything about that space is still there. But growing up, I am a child of Caribbean immigrants. And much of my friends either came from the continent or, through the diaspora from the Caribbean, as well as including those from the South. And a lot of the ways in which I even think about storytelling, choose to use storytelling as a methodology, even in my own research. As an aside, in addition to being a university professor, I am a researcher and consultant. So I tend to work for a lot of mid-size and large nonprofits and foundations doing a lot of the work that I do. So much of the work that I am engaged in brings me back into communities, very much like the ones that I grew up in Brooklyn, and listening to all the kinds of issues as they relate to housing discrimination and health equity and education and all these sorts of things. And so I enjoy the stories. A lot of our culture as African descendants are rooted in storytelling. And that's where a lot of the learning, a lot of the information takes place anyway. And so that's how my roots help to inform me professionally, but I also like stories and watching novellas. And when my grandmother was alive, we were watching, The Days of Our Lives and The Young and the Restless. And that's another form of storytelling as well. And there are always these teachable moments, even in those kinds of stories. And so that's how I just integrate storytelling as part of my work. But it's something that's very familiar to me from when I grew up.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a rhythm in storytelling. There's a rhythm in neighborhoods, right? And to be able to capture that, a lot of people from the outside looking in don't recognize the rhythms that we do, right? You start to hear things that are familiar, and the same voices ring through the windows, and
Right.
the same type of conversations, where their arguments are good ones, they kind of start to repeat themselves. And that's a rhythm, that's a story, right, in and of itself. Forget dialogue, that's the extra, right,
Right.
inside of storytelling. Our whole world is a story in a lot of ways.
Mm.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and especially growing up in Brooklyn. The first Afros and Audio conference was in Brooklyn, and it was very intentional. This is a place that is teeming with culture and
Mm.
energy and people, So
Yes.
I love that. I love that. So you have an extensive background in sociology, as you mentioned. So how does that influence the way you approach your storytelling?
Well, I don't want to bore folks in terms of the methodologies that exist. But for those who may be unfamiliar with the field itself, sociology is the study of people, cultures, and society, right? But then we look very broadly in terms of, well, how do not just necessarily individuals, but individuals within groups, within communities, how is it that we engage with one another? How is it that we inform, but how these communities also get informed by policies and practices and changes in culture and migration and people. So it's looking at a very macro sense of just who we are and who we live amongst when we talk about communities, for example, or even institutions. So, one of my first books, which I don't know, you could probably see behind me, it's called Creating Black Caribbean Identity. And as a sociologist, I was quite curious in listening to the stories of my own family members that first came to the United States and were told very explicitly that when you go to utilize particular institutions around healthcare, around legal services, which identities, which Black identities would be accepted or not so much welcomed. And I thought that's very interesting for Black people in a sense when they're coming to a new place, because even if they've never really encountered the same sort of explicitness around race and racism in their home countries, when you come to a place like the United States, it's an interesting confrontation where one has to then think about, how do I reconcile the things that I may have heard or learned about before I immigrated, and then what am I experiencing once I'm here? And I was just blown away to hear family members say, well, when you go into this particular organization that's supposed to serve you regardless, right? If you're in there for healthcare, no one should be discriminating against you just based on your national origin. However, the explicitness of being told, well, when you go in here, you say that you're Black, but you don't say that you're Caribbean, or that, and this is before the name of African American became popular, but imagine someone saying, well, don't say that you're from Alabama, just say your peoples are from the South. It's very interesting, because then what does it signal to you about how you're choosing to show up in these spaces and expressing yourself and talking about your Blackness as it's impacting you in this new place? And so as a sociologist, I really like to think about not just communities where we live and where we worship and where we patronize our businesses and where we celebrate culture, but also when we interact with institutions around us, schools, hospitals, all these entities. How is it that we are treated? How is it that we learn about ourselves, how we need to navigate these spaces? And I think, fast forward, that's some of the things that we tend to talk about anyway, naturally, when we're looking at things like, well, what was the long-term effects of the pandemic, both the Black Lives Matter pandemic in terms of a global experience, as well as COVID. How did we show up? How did health professionals treat us in these spaces? So all those things. But I think about being a sociologist when I'm asking the kinds of questions of my guests, and them talking about their experiences and their journeys as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's boring at all. Not that you were inferring that, but I think that it's important, right, to recognize that there are certain folks who approach this medium with a different lens, with an intentional lens, with an intentional approach to what it is they're curating, who they are speaking with, and who's telling their stories. There's a methodology to it for some of us. And I think it's important for that person who may be sitting there is like, well, I have this inside of me, but I don't know how to approach it. I don't know how to put this excellence in this medium or this knowledge in this medium. What you just shared is very important for that creator, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's creativity inside of all of what you're doing, right? So no, it's important. So thank you again for sharing that. So with over 20 years in academia, how do you balance your role as an educator and your podcasting endeavors?
Is there ever a balance? So, I embody so many other roles outside of those things. And so for me, it's more than just being an educator, being a researcher, being a writer. I'm also a wife, a mother, a daughter, a friend. I mean, the myriad of different identities that I embody simultaneously comes into it. And I don't really ever think that there is a true balance. It's just about how we are prioritizing certain things in certain moments, right? And then trying to find some sort of joy in that prioritization. I enjoy having conversations and learning. I even if I wasn't an academic by training or a researcher, I think I just have this curiosity, this mind that just wants to ask questions and to learn and to understand even more. And I sort of think that there are so many other people in the world that are like me. I mean, I think that's why people like to hear when tea is being spilled, because you want to know all the things, right? And so the balance is really just infusing joy and creativity. And when I have my guests come on, it's more than just asking them questions about, well, what did you do? Step 1, step 2, step 3, because I realized as we experience it ourselves living, that there isn't any direct or linear approach to how we travel along this journey, along this path. And sometimes there are forks in the path. Sometimes there are potholes in the path. But then I ask them, ways in which they choose to play, right? Where's the joy? What was the impetus for them doing the thing that they're doing today? And there is consensus around there's no balance, but we find space to do the things that intrigue us, that spark that intellectual curiosity, that fulfills our passion and our purpose. And so that's how I see what it is that I do as an educator, researcher, and as a podcaster. I'm trying to marry those things together as opposed to just seeking balance, because then I'd be going crazy if I was trying to balance it all, because, you know, life be lifing, as my students tell me all the time.
For sure, for sure. And I love that. It's almost like there's a deliberate socialization not to be connected with joy, right? Joy
Mm-hmm.
in our experiences, joy in our work, all of these things. And I'm glad that you shared that. Again, I've loved all the stories so far. And this is just another one of those moments to say, oh, yeah, joy. I forgot about that.
Right.
Yeah, that gets to be a pursuit, you know,
Mm-hmm.
inside of the balance and what we do. So I love that. So, Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, your podcast has gained international acclaim. Can you tell us about its evolution and the impact it has had on both you and your audience?
Wow. So I will say that I'm very grateful to my audience, my listeners. I know that it's more than just my mom and my daddy listening, so that's great. I would like to say thank you to those who have been early adopters, and even those who are just discovering the podcast. The kind of feedback that I've received through emails and direct messages is the thing that propels me to do this even more, right? Um, Worldwide acclaim is interesting because I realize that the kinds of guests that I have on the show, I think, are reflective of people's interests, needs, people want to learn more about. Um, I was actually surprised to receive the metrics that in the middle of season 5, we are in 71 countries worldwide. I'm thinking, wow, that's cool. And the consistency of my listenership is just phenomenal in that particular way. But I think it's in part because I emphasize the diaspora, right? So African descendants are everywhere, right? And that our voices are unique, even in these very disparate geographic locations. And I think people revel in being able to be seen and their stories being heard in these spaces, which I think once they discover the podcast, they're like, wow, I'm hearing about people who are similar to me. We may have different experiences, speak different languages, have very different geopolitical situations, but there's something that resonates, that speaks to the experiences. And it's been affirming in that particular way. Um, it's been humbling also, too, to think, wow, an idea that I had back in 2019 has since galvanized into this particular platform and is still growing. And so I feel very proud. I feel very humbled. I feel very thankful. There's so much gratitude that I have in my heart and in my spirit to be able to do this work.
That's awesome. And speaking of your guests, you've interviewed a range of fascinating individuals from Oscar winners to influential community leaders. Can you share a memorable moment or a profound insight gained from one of these interviews?
Well, that's a bit of a challenge because they're all so different. I just want to say that I think overall, whether they are folks that professionally were in a space where they're doing uh, AIDS research on the continent of Africa, to being the first Black astronaut to walk in space, to even being an Academy Award winner. It's easy to then lean on those that have more celebrity to say, oh my gosh, and it's cool, right? At least for me, not to try to fan girl out or just fan out because of their celebrity status. But I think overall, there isn't any specific memorable moment that I would attribute to a particular guest, but I would say the thread that's been consistent across all of my conversations with my guests are a couple of things. The lessons that they've learned, the ways in which they talk about the importance of resiliency, the ways in which they tell their stories in a way that's so humble. And I think that's what resonates with folks, because regardless of their celebrity or everyday status, they are just like you and I. And when I talk about resiliency, it's not just the ability to bounce back, but in their conversations talking about that when they've had a misstep or have fallen or received a no, the no was really a next opportunity. It was a way for them to enact on skills that they didn't realize that they had in order to help them out of that particular challenge and overcome. I mean, it's those sorts of things that I'm just thinking, wow. And when you hear people's experiences, near death experiences that they happen to share with me on the mic, where it's taken them down another sort of trajectory that I'm thinking, oh my goodness, you could have easily done X, Y, Z, but you chose otherwise. And maybe that choice was informed by your previous experiences. It was informed by the community of people that you surround yourself with. But there was something that aided in your resiliency to be able to bounce back and then to be able to sit with me and tell your story that I hope that will inspire other people listening, that there's something to learn. I think overall, people oftentimes shared that regardless of the hurdles, the challenges, it's really to pursue your dreams, to understand that your life is worthy, you are worthy, that it's important for us as African descendants specifically to be able to receive, because oftentimes our stories are framed in a narrative that's not about joy, but it's all about trauma. And so when you hear someone give you an encouraging word that, oh, I went through it, but there's joy here, I can laugh through this, and you can too. I think those are the memorable instances. So not one guest or one particular story, but I would say writ large, I think that's the beauty of people's stories. No matter how celebrity or how impressive their accolades are, that's who we are as a people. We are joyful people. That's why our stories are so great when we tell them. They're colorful, they're exciting. There's so much imagery. You can even, as you talked about earlier, there's a rhythm in our stories. Well, that's the joy that's in us, right?
I love that. I've said I love a lot because I do. So I
It's good to
really,
love,
um,
right?
yes, absolutely. And I appreciate this conversation around people. We are folks who have access to decision making and choices, and
Mm.
how we use those in any given day is kind of up to us. But in a lot of ways, you spoke to a philosophy I have in that celebrity and or our heroes, there's nothing supernatural about them. They're just humans like you and I who have decided to make a choice, to take action on a certain thing or to be a certain way.
Mm.
So I love that. And yeah, more people get to really understand that we are all the same. We have access to choice, decision, with all the nuances inside of that, the impediments of society and all of that. So I want to speak about the audience. And you mentioned
Mm.
them in the previous answer as well. So what strategies have you found most effective in engaging and expanding your global audience? Because as you mentioned, and it's worth noting again, from 43 countries to 71 in just 3 months, that is major. Congratulations. What strategies have you found?
I'm still trying to find those strategies, if I'm to be honest. I think one of the things that's interesting is that on the one hand, I think what has contributed to the success of the show to date has been honestly word of mouth. Because if I were to look, and my students remind me, in fact, they even tease me all the time, um, they remind me that I don't have a huge social media following. And it doesn't necessarily comport with the metrics that we receive about the show. So it lets me know that it's really word of mouth in terms of the thousands of downloads the show has gotten per month to date. And then also with the countrywide expansion and listenership. So I would say that's the success so far, the word of mouth, but I'm not satisfied with that. Perhaps that's the competitiveness in me that I'm like, oh, what can we do to make it better? But I also want to be cautious in terms of aligning the worthiness of the show to, the popular metrics of you need to have X amount of thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers and listeners. And that sort of thing, as we see when we go on IG or Twitter or something like that. I get it from a monetization standpoint, where you might have folks that are interested in, well, I need for you to have certain number of followers, even if those followers are bots, but that's a whole other conversation, to make it worthwhile for them to then invest in so that your show can be monetized. And I don't necessarily want to be up in that particular spin, because I think that for myself personally, that it would take the show down another avenue. I think that people who like the show and refer it to other folks in their network, in their community, that's my target audience. I'm up for expanding it because I think there are so many more people who would be interested. But I don't want these numbers of trying to gain following to be a distraction. I just don't want followers for followers. I want folks who, just like my early adopters and listeners are invested in the program, invested in me, invested in the content, that will continue on with folks that find the show. So, I'm very proud of the success in, air quotes, that we've been able to achieve, but there's still opportunity for growth. I just want to be measured in the approach and be very thoughtful about how is it that we're going to continue to grow in the future. And to be quite honest, I want to retire from academia, and I would love this thing to just pay for itself or more. Why not get paid from it in a significant way? Why not? I'm just going to put that in the ether. We're going to manifest that. I'm big on manifestation and speaking positivity. So I just want to get paid to be able to do the thing that brings me joy, to have the conversations with folks that are joyful, and to share that joy with others.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of that where the opportunity is there and you get to grow it as you go and as you want. I think the best part about one of the best parts about podcasting is that it gets to be on your own terms in a lot of ways. And because it's yours, you get to treat it and create it and grow it, scale it however you want. And the good news is that when you recognize that every opportunity isn't an opportunity, then you are way better off in curating your own opportunities. So no, that's great. And it is something to be said about content that speaks for itself. And you are doing that. So once
Thank you.
again, so drawing from your own experiences, if you had any key pieces of advice that you would offer to podcast hosts that may be just starting out or veteran, it could be the same message, it could be two different messages. But what would you advise people, and when they have something as important, to talk about, important to address, important to expose to the world, what would you say to them?
Well, I would start off by saying it's great to collaborate and to be in community with others. I have benefited from the support, and I want to just make sure that I shout out my collaborator who has really, I've been under his tutelage. His name is Masauko. He's actually an award-winning producer and musician and songwriter himself. And so when I first started off with the podcast, he just thought, this is great. This is awesome, Yndia. Just definitely go for it. And I'm self-taught between YouTube and just tinkering around the internet. How do I use this software? What sort of mic do I need to use? And et cetera, et cetera. And he has taught me so much, and he has even contributed to and worked on many of my episodes where we're creating original music together. We're going back and forth because, as a sidebar, I realized that in the midst of all my busyness, I actually like to make beats. I used to be a college DJ and I used to have my own show when I was in college many, many years ago. And so perhaps it's a procrastination tool to just all of a sudden create hot beats. And then I realized, oh, I have a life, I have deadlines to adhere to. And so to being in the spirit of collaboration with him in particular has been truly helpful to me as I'm growing as a digital creator and in this space as a podcaster. I'm learning different things, and it's been a nice evolution. So if I were to give advice to whether they are newcomers or veterans, it would be, this doesn't necessarily need to be a siloed experience, that it's important to be in community and to collaborate. You know, it's almost like when I tell my students about not just having a mentor, but having a sponsor, right? And mentors are important because mentors are only individuals that have a particular skill set that they can then teach you should you want to and have an interest in learning. But this person that can be your mentor could be someone who's younger than you or more senior to you. It doesn't necessarily always have to be that dynamic that I think most of us grow up with, where you're just like the young Padawan and then you need to have, like, you know, Yoda come down and tell you, oh, this is what you need to do. You can have someone who's younger, but whose show is hot and popping, and you're like, wow, I like what they're doing. I can learn from them, and you can be under their tutelage. And there's a nice exchange because you being a newbie too, you can learn from the veteran can learn from a newbie as well, right? That's being in community and in collaboration. And sponsorship, not in the formal sense of monetization for your show, but sponsorship in that if I hear about an opportunity, I'll mention your name or your show, and that's how we get exposed, right? So, for example, even me learning about you, I learned about you through Black Podcasting Association, right? And then look at this, I'm learning about your program, your platform, your, you know, conferences, all the things, right? Because of just that sponsorship, that being in community and being in collaboration. So I would say that is a primary space, because I think sometimes people feel like, oh, I guess I'm doing this on my own, and who else is doing this? And right. And then we end up spinning in place and not making as much progress, but you don't have to go at it alone. And don't give up, because this is something that there is a learning curve, but you have to stay persistent, I would say. You know, there are many, many podcasts that oftentimes don't last beyond one season because people realize this joint is hard. It takes up a lot of time, right? And so you have to persevere and be persistent. And I guess one last thing I would say, I didn't know that I was going to have 3, you know, takeaways, but I would say for folks, particularly those who are newbies, but as well as veterans, is just know the field. Listen to other podcasts too, right? So, and to listen to podcasts that are in different genres from your own, you might learn something. You might be inspired by something in terms of the ways in which people are formatting their show. Maybe there are certain kinds of issues that you think, oh, wow, they're speaking about this. I think this is something that I could dovetail a different kind of conversation and bring to my audience because they too can benefit. Or you just might realize, I like that host. Why don't we work on something together and then collaborate that way? So it's just, again, that goes back to being in community and being in collaboration, but just sometimes just know what's out there. Like as a writer, I read other people's books, right? I need to be able to know, what are people saying about racism in America? You know, like I need to know what's being said and kind of be up on my chops. So why not do this as part of perfecting your craft? So those are my 3 takeaways.
I appreciate all of them. There was this old thought of to be a great writer, you must be an avid reader, right? And so you're speaking to that. Community and collaboration, absolutely. That's Afros and Audio. We're committed to community and collaboration, right? Because understanding that creatives for traditionally work in silos, right? We got our head down. We don't look to our left and our right to say, is there support, right? Is there someone that can tell me something in 5 minutes and not have me toiling for 3 months trying to figure out, oh, you just need to push that button. That's all I need to do.
Right.
It's those type of things where support and community and collaboration and, you know, understanding what this world looks like. It just, once that's expanded because of the people, right? The people are part of community. Once that's expanded, the worldview just, it goes crazy. And the more content you have, the more people to lean on. Absolutely. That is great advice. I appreciate all three takeaways. And I know that the folks listening will too. So thank you. Are there any upcoming projects or episodes that you are particularly excited about? And could you give us a sneak peek? Anything?
Oh, I love to. So, given that this is February and Black History Month, coincidentally, this second half of my season, and I just want to say my season runs from September to June. Because of my bandwidth, I only have one episode per month. I think that people have a different cadence. So every month I have a new episode in that 10-month period. But effective this month, February, I actually kick off a kind of a mini series within the podcast called Diasporic Journeys, where I actually highlight my most recent trip to South Africa and to Zimbabwe. And it was just really compelling and interesting to be able to traverse through these very different countries, different parts of the country. So I kick off in Johannesburg and I interview and sit with a woman by the name of Antoinette Sitole, whose brother is part of this iconic movement that happened in the 70s called that was related to like Youth Education Day, where at 12 years old, he was one of the first people that was shot and gunned down by the apartheid police against these hundreds of thousands of school children, I think as young as 5 years old to about 17, who were protesting to say we didn't want apartheid in the school. Right. And so meeting with her and traversing through Johannesburg and being in Soweto and speaking with her and on the grounds of a museum and monument that's named in her brother's name, that's used as a way to educate folks, right? Or just me talking with renowned author and sociologist Tessa Dooms about her most recent book on apartheid and colorism and what does that mean to be colored. It's very different when we talk about that within the context of being here in the United States as it does in South Africa. And so her talking about that, and then me traveling down to Cape Town and speaking with people who identify as colored and what does it mean even now in post-apartheid South Africa. And then traveling up to Stellenbosch, where I sit with the first fully owned Black wine farm owners in the entire country. And them talking about what does it mean to have come out of apartheid to then go purchase land that they weren't even allowed to buy. And then to farm it and to be these wine vineyard folks selling globally, right? And then venturing up to Zimbabwe, where I met with a Black woman who owns the first 5-star Black hotel in all of the country. And her talking about what it is to be a Black woman, to be a Zimbabwean, to be global in that particular respect. And so I just thought, why not share these particular stories, especially since now my audience is like very much global. I have a lot of listeners on the continent, from the Ivory Coast to Kenya to Malawi to Ghana. I mean, I'm sure they would like to learn a little bit more about their fellow neighbors on the continent, in addition to learning about us who are in Europe or who are in the Caribbean or Central and South America and the United States. And so I'm really looking forward to that because I think it really emphasizes this notion of we are everywhere. And so I'm just going to highlight a certain place. And hopefully in the future, I will be blessed with the opportunity to go to other parts of not just the continent, but other places where I get to connect with African descendants and really speak to the mission and the purpose of the show, which is to highlight our global experiences, our lives, our voices, our stories about what it means to be in these spaces. So that's what I'm looking forward to, and I really hope that listeners tune in. I kick off on I think the second week of February with the episode, so I'm looking forward to people's feedback and them liking it and telling their friends and all the good things.
Sounds super exciting. I can't wait to hear it. Be honest with you. Sounds exciting. And I just want you to talk about it a little bit more briefly. And started planning this trip. You said, I know I'll do this for the podcast. Or was it an afterthought? Or how did you like determine this is something I get to like incorporate and create inside the podcast, even though I've been doing this one thing or, several things iterating, but I'd like to introduce this to my listeners and into the podcast. How did you make it happen for yourself?
I mean, am I selfish to say I'm thinking, well, if I think this is interesting, someone else will? So, I think in many ways, it is a bit of a selfish endeavor in that I'm sharing things with folks that I'm interested in and making a lot of assumptions that other people are interested in it too. Um, so I think that's sort of even how I go about identifying guests, or even when guests pitch me and approach me and I make the determination about, whether it fits with the season or the kinds of stories that I've been able to tell thus far, that sort of thing. So when I think about traveling around and, as a researcher, I always have my tape recorder. We invest in these sorts of pieces of equipment to really have some really good equipment to travel around. And for me, it's just, you never know. And so I always try to be prepared in that particular way. It wasn't like, oh, let me go out and do this on this particular trip or on any of my other trips. But I have the tape recorder there. And, I was very fortunate that when I'm traveling, not just to a place like South Africa and Zimbabwe, but in other instances where I've traveled and I've encountered folks, maybe I'm personable to folks. Sometimes I could be a bit standoffish because, I have that Brooklyn mug, like, look, don't come talk to me. I have my headphones on. This is what we're doing right now. But I think that when I'm in that spirit of, yeah, let's have a conversation, I think people are open. And I'm like, hold on a minute. And then I whip out the tape recorder and say, would you mind? And they're like, sure. And then it's a whole conversation and becomes this other thing. Then I'm thinking, yo, that was dope. So I'm going to share this with other folks because I think other people can have the same sort of takeaway or similar takeaways like I did. And so that's how I try to operate and take advantage of these opportunities. Maybe it's serendipity, maybe it's not, but I'm just trying to be in the moment and take advantage. And there are times that I've missed opportunities where I'm like, oh, my battery died and I didn't bring a backup, or this was lost, or but then that's when I get the information like, so can I email you? What's your handle? Let's connect again. And then, we can sort of, take up the mantle that way. So
That's exciting. I'm really excited that for you and those opportunities that you were able to create. But really can't wait. Truly can't wait to hear these episodes. Sounds awesome. So I just have a couple of more questions for you, and I'm gonna let you
sure.
go.
Okay.
As someone deeply involved, right, in celebrating Black voices and identities, how do you see the role of podcasting in shaping and sharing these narratives?
Mm. Critical. I mean, just in a word, critical. So I will say this as an academic and and as a researcher. So when I also work as a consultant for those different organizations that I talked about, whether it's the United Way or large foundations of that nature that are national, at least here in the US, or those that are in Canada or in the Caribbean, we have reports that result from the research that I've been contracted to do. And they sit someplace on a website. Maybe there are other people in the field that will venture and read, or if, let's say, those pieces, or even in academia, gets published in a journal or in a book. Again, the audience is very limited. There's a lot of presumptions about who the readership will be at that particular point. And I think that a lot of the work that I realized that I've been doing, even in my own book research for myself, even for the project that was really the impetus for the podcast, I always had the mind of, when I'm in community, you have folks that have different abilities, different access, right? There's a lot of disparity, at least on that realm, and that what good for me and the work itself if it's somewhere else in a place that people don't have access to, or you need to have particular privileges just to access, right? So the digital divide becomes really important and significant in terms of how do you access this, or even the books that I've written that have been mainly targeted towards educators and those in the university. Some of my books are $65. That already prices out the audience that I'm hoping to target to begin with, right? And so even for me, this last book that I'm writing that's similarly titled to the podcast, my whole goal is for it to be accessible. But when I think about podcasts as a field, I'm thinking I don't want it to be in the ways in which I've personally witnessed academia or research, that it's only a particular segment of the population and that be the place where our stories reside. Because in terms of volume, no one's reading these stories in the same way. But because podcast is a digital form, and that as long as you have access to the internet and understanding that you can access it through your public library or other public institutions where you have access to free resources, then you're not limited to be able to then hear and take advantage of these stories and these experiences and these great people and creatives that are putting forth this content. And so when you ask me about the importance of podcasting, it's critical in terms of the affirmation that we need to have within our community to know that we exist in all of these different spaces, right? And that we can't just rely on the mediums that we readily have access to, like the Googles, like our network news stations, right? Because they're only telling a segment and a fragment of a story that's framed in a way that's oftentimes negative to begin with, right? And so podcasting is critical, specifically for our African descended voices. I feel affirmed in the comments that people are like, I feel seen. Like, that's literally a comment, a phrase that I've heard repeatedly over the years. I feel seen. I feel heard. This is like me. This is similar. We're not all the same, but this resonates. And to me, I'm thinking, wow, if we can, perfect our craft as digital creators, as podcasters in this space, then the sky's the limit in terms of our reach, in terms of our ability to galvanize, in terms of our ability to bring about the change that we want to see all around us, even if it's on our block, to just globally. So the promise is there for a better future. And we have the power to be able to do that now. So I was a little preachy, but that's what I think about podcasting and us as African descendants globally and locally.
All right. That was a great answer. And I often say, people may be tired of hearing me say it, but who cares? This is my platform. We get to say what we want on ours.
You say what
right?
you want to say.
Exactly. Yes. That this work, Frozen Audio Podcast Festival, it's just a guise. I just want more and more of us to tell our stories. This is us laying our living record down right now in this moment. Yes. Wherever you are, however you're telling your story. this won't be able to be manipulated in a way that says, I know what they meant when they said that. No, I said what I meant when I said it, right?
Right,
You heard it
right.
very clearly. This
Yeah,
is
it's like
us.
we are living archivists,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
And our episodes serve as a repository of these stories. So to your point, no one can deny that it happened. No one can reframe the narrative. The narrative is the narrative, right? And as
Absolutely.
long as it's in existence, then that can't be taken away in that particular, we have power. Go on.
It's so powerful. It's powerful work. It's important work that we're doing, and definitely important work that you're doing. This is our opportunity to lay this down. So, for those that are interested in delving deeper into your work, what resources or starting points would you recommend?
Well, I would invite folks to maybe go to my website, because then if you're interested in exploring some of my academic pieces, um, at least the titles of my books are there, and you can learn about the podcast in more in depth. And so my website is www.yndialorick-wilmot.com. I would probably recommend that how my name is being spelled is how you could write it all the way out for the website. You can also find me on the socials, as my students like to tell me. I don't know, they make me feel old sometimes. And I'm like, I'm not that old, although I am, because I have children their ages too. So it's just like, but they remind me constantly. I have fun with them. But I'm on IG, and it's Prof Yndia, PROF, and then YNDIA. I'm also on the podcast is also on IG, and it's Journeys, the letter B, the number 2, B _ podcast. And then I'm also on Twitter under Prof Yndia, and then also on Facebook at Journeys of Belonging to Blackness. If you search it, you'll be able to find. And I try my best to keep things up to date and relevant. I actually have a YouTube channel too, which I think that if you just search for me, Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, you'll be able to see where I'm at a little bit. I don't tend to curate as much content as I should, but I think, 2024, I'm aspiring that I will have my socials far more organized and reflective of the success that you highlighted earlier, because right now my students tell me it's abysmal. So, but that's where you can find me to keep in touch with me and to follow along and to know when the latest episodes come out. If you want to, feel free to leave me comments and likes and share with your friends and family. I would love it. I'd love to see you all there and to have you all keep listening.
Absolutely. I just want you to thank you for sharing that, and things, and all of the handles in the description for people to be able to go right to you. So, as we close out this conversation, and it's been really one that I am grateful to have had.
Likewise.
So good. I really appreciate your mind and your contribution to the space and your approach to storytelling. It is refreshing, and I'm really, really excited about hearing more. And I'm hoping that the folks who are listening get into it, because there's some great stuff. So,
Yeah.
what is one message or thought you would like to leave with our audience as we celebrate Black History Month?
One thought?
One
You did
thought.
that on purpose. Well, I think I'll answer it this way. So I appreciate the Black History Month as it being February, but Black history is 365. So perhaps that this month be the month that folks, if you hadn't been dialed in, that you're using this month as the starting point to get dialed in. So those who are following your series will get dialed in, learn more about other kinds of podcasts, including mine, and realize, well, what speaks to my heart? And then to be able to learn more, to experience more. I think I think that's the thing. I think there's so much that's out there about our lives as African descendants broadly that we don't always know about. Like, we know about ourselves. Do we even know things about our own family members and how they move through the world as Black people, if that's the way they identify? Right? What about our neighbor, our community, our neighborhood, our state, it just starts to grow in that particular way. And I would just love that if you haven't been dialed in a particular way, that we use this month as an opportunity to get dialed in and to be able to experience the joys, to learn, to spread the word, perhaps to even be inspired, that folks tap into their own creativity and to do other things in terms of expressing this, you know, perhaps newfound or reinvigorated joy around Blackness in a way that they may or may not have had recently. It's I want this month to be one that folks are inspired and that we're sort of cultivating a practice around investing in us and celebrating us
Mhm.
and amplifying us. And so I guess that's my takeaway, that it's really 365 is all day, every day. We are here. And I want folks to really just lean into it this month and then carry forth for all the other days to come.
Absolutely. That was a great response to a very broad question and, and intentional. I knew you'd answer it in perfection. So I
Oh, thank
appreciate you
you.
for that. So once again, thanks again for this conversation. I'm going to close this out and just stay right there for me. All right.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I want to give a big thanks to our Afros in Audio and Black Podcasters Association members for supporting our commitment for community and collaboration. If you'd like to join the Black Podcast Association, the link will be in the description below. And if you want to join us at the 6th annual Afros in Audio Podcast Festival, visit afrosinaudio.com. Follow Afros in Audio on all social media channels, and you can follow me at Talib Jasir on IG. Thanks again, Yndia, for being a part of Afros in Audio's Black History Month interview series. It's been awesome talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.